My name is Hannah Dahlberg-Dodd, Project Assistant Professor at Tokyo College, and I'll be the moderator of today's session. Before we begin, I would like to direct your attention to the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. If you prefer to listen to today's lecture in Japanese, please feel free to select the Japanese button for live English to Japanese interpretation. The title of today's lecture is Affective, or Kansei, Robotics in Japan, Designing and Programming Gender and Emotions in Humanoid Robots. It is my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Professor Jennifer Robertson. Professor Robertson is a visiting professor at Tokyo College and Professor Emerita in University of Michigan's Departments of Anthropology and the History of Art, the Penny W. School of Art and Design, and affiliate professor in UM's Robotics Institute. As a historical anthropologist, or anthropological historian, her 7 books and over 90 articles and chapters address a wide spectrum of interdisciplinary subjects ranging from the 17th century to the present, including, but not limited to, nativist and social rectification movements, sex and gender systems and ideologies, nostalgia and internationalization, urbanism, and robotics. For today's session, we will begin with the lecture by Professor Robertson, after which we will hear commentary from Professor NAGAI Yukie, project professor in the University of Tokyo's International Research Center for Neurointelligence. Professor Nagai has won numerous awards for her research, which deals with computational approaches to the underlying neural mechanisms for social cognitive development. She designs neural network models for robots to learn and acquire cognitive functions such as self-other recognition, estimation of others' intention and emotion, and altruism. The remaining time will be used for discussion, and if we have time at the end, we will have a short Q&A session. One quick note for the audience, please use the Q&A functions provided at the bottom of the Zoom window to send us your questions. Professor Robertson, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dahlberg-Dodd, for your kind introduction. And I'd like to begin by thanking some colleagues. First, a big thank you to Professor Haneda Masashi for inviting me to Tokyo College as a visiting professor. COVID delayed my arrival here by about 3 years. I also want to thank Ms. Shibata Eriko for her generous assistance from even before my arrival. And for agreeing to serve as the commentator for today's talk, I'd like to thank Professor NAGAI Yukie, an internationally recognized neuroscientist and project professor at the International Research Center for Neurointelligence here at Todai. Thanks also to Ms. Takahira Yoshiko and Ms. Dai Li Ping for working on the logistics of the broadcast. And a very special thank you to anthropologist, and here I need to share my screen, so 1 second. Here is the title picture, and to resume my thank yous to anthropologist Professor Terima Junko from Tsukuba University, who agreed to step out of her comfort zone and serve as the simultaneous interpreter for this webinar. We've worked together in the past, and I'm delighted to be doing so again today. I'd also like to note that this talk draws from my recent book, Robosapiens Japanicus, Robots, Gender, Family, and the Japanese Nation, and includes a lot of new material. Today's talk is a bit shorter than my usual presentations, and thus I had to leave out some pages on artificial intelligence and emotions, itself a complete talk, but you can get some background information and context from my book, from this article in particular, Technologies of Kokoro, and also from the video that you see here. Now, a number of Japanese roboticists have designed their gendered robots based on simplified sex and gender stereotypes of human, female, and male bodies. Moreover, some of these gendered robots are programmed with algorithms, or AI, similarly based on the presumption of inherent human, female, and male behavioral differences. In the short time I have available today, I will focus primarily on what I and others find problematic and even troubling about the construction of gender in robot design and AI algorithms. Obviously, I'm not alone in expressing concern about robot design and AI. Some of you may have seen this article in The Guardian on the 9th of February, and I quote, "Images posted on social media are analyzed by algorithms that decide what to amplify and what to suppress. Many of these algorithms, the Guardian investigation has found, have a gender bias and may have been censoring and suppressing the reach of countless photos featuring women's bodies. For example, Google's algorithm scored a picture of a pregnant belly that you see here as, quote, very likely to contain racy content. And Microsoft's algorithm was 90% confident that the image was sexually suggestive in nature. In other words, relative to men's bodies, women's bodies are disproportionately classified as unacceptably sexually suggestive and thus censored. The chief ethics scientist at Hugging Face, an American company that develops tools for building applications using machine learning, is quoted in The Guardian as saying that, quote, these kinds of algorithms are often recreating social biases. It means that people who tend to be marginalized are even further marginalized, end quote. This algorithm fostered censorship has hurt female-led businesses, such as, for example, prenatal care, further amplifying societal disparities. So that was from The Guardian. I'll be showing pictures of real robots further along, but let me begin with some working definitions. What is a robot? What is AI? What is an algorithm? How is sex different from gender? It's the case that these terms are widely invoked in everyday speech and in the mass media as if everyone already knows what they mean. But this may not be the case. For example, I've found that most people who come to my lectures perceive of real-world, tangible robots in terms of what they know about robots from science fiction novels, comics, and movies. So I'll begin with the etymology of robot, followed by a working definition. Now, the English word robot derives from the Czech word robota, or manual laborer. It was coined by literator Karl Čapek and his artist brother, Joseph Čapek, and first appeared in the former's play RUR, or Rossum's Universal Robots, which was published in 1920. RUR was staged in Prague in 1921 and in cities all over the world, including Tokyo in 1924. Very briefly, RUR is a science fiction melodrama with comical passages, and it's about an island factory where realistic artificial humans are made for global export as tireless workers. The newest model robots are provided with a soul and emotions, which enables them to experience anger at their exploitation by humans. All of the robots join forces and kill all but one human. And you see here an image of the robot revolt in the Tokyo production. It was in the mid-1920s that roboto quickly became a ubiquitous buzzword in Japan. Before roboto, the expressions jinzo ningen, artificial human, and kikai ningen, machine or mechanical human, were used to name manufactured human-like beings. Now, many definitions of robots are in circulation today, and I've assembled one from a variety of literature that is comprehensive yet concise. A robot is an assemblage of different technologies, sensors, optics, software, including some level of artificial intelligence, telecommunication tools, actuators, batteries, polymers, even biological cells that make it capable of navigating and interacting with its environment with some human supervision by remote control or through teleoperations. Now, some robots are usefully perceived as embodied AI in the sense that they are equipped with software algorithms that facilitate their ability to interact with their surroundings, to recognize patterns, and to complete given tasks. Not all the robots I show in this presentation are robotic in the same way, but they all have a combination of some of these features. Robots are made from many different materials: aluminum, stainless steel, thermoplastic polymers, polycarbonates, acrylics, silicon, even biological cells, and they exist in many different shapes and sizes. The vast majority of robots are industrial robots that are installed in automobile and other factories. Other robots, as you see here, have been designed as animals, fish, rice cookers, bathtubs, wheelchairs, vacuum cleaners, and commodes. Humanoid robots have a body that resembles a human being in the sense of having something like a head, arms, torso, and legs. And as you see here, most humanoids are gendered, and some, called androids, have silicone faces and hands that can pass, from a distance at least, as flesh and blood human beings. They are immobile, apart from making teleoperated facial expressions and vocalizations. And I'll be talking a bit more about these androids later. Now, a 5-year project to develop humanoid robots was launched by the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, or METI, in 1998. And Honda's masculine gendered Ashimo was one of the first humanoids introduced to the public in 2000. Many humanoid robots like Ashimo, whose production ended in 2018, are not end products in themselves, but rather they are research platforms. Now, humanoids and robots in general are very expensive technologies, and humanoids in particular are very challenging to build. So the innovations in haptics, optics, balance, and locomotion that go into their production are applied in more useful and more lucrative new industries. Now, Ashimo himself, as you see here, generated new mobility devices. Some of the other lucrative new industries include weapon systems and drones, and of course also surveillance. The triple disaster of March 2011, the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown, effectively reduced funding for humanoid robots, which proved to be utterly useless for rescue and cleanup operations following this disaster. Now, for many people, the word robot conjures up the humanoids in science fiction movies, novels, and comics that have amazing abilities. And by contrast, real-world humanoids are rather slow and clumsy, even though they represent cutting-edge technologies. I also want to emphasize that humanoids are a very tiny minority of all the types of robots produced, even though they tend to get all of the media attention. Moreover, I cannot repeat and emphasize enough that actual robots should not be confused or equated with science fiction robots. And the tendency to do this, in my view, is a huge flaw in a lot of social science scholarship on robots. Now, what's an algorithm? What is AI? Briefly, in computer programming, an algorithm is a set of finite instructions or rules to be followed in calculations or other problem-solving operations. AI is basically a group of algorithms that create and categorize new data from these problem-solving operations. These new data, in turn, allow a computer or robot to operate automatically or intelligently without direct human intervention, up to a point. There is no universal definition of AI, and there are many competing definitions. And when asked, most people on the street would provide not a definition, but rather an example of an AI application, such as Apple's Siri or Google search engine. AI, as a group of algorithms or finite rules, is very useful for streaming or streamlining certain quantifiably calculable processes, like moves on a chessboard or Go board, which are informed by pattern recognition. But as you saw in the Guardian article I opened with, and as you will see in my next example, one of the pitfalls of AI is that it cannot think outside the box, so to speak. It cannot think outside the board game. It acts on prior data. Thus, gendered robots tend to reflect, reproduce, and amplify the implicit and unreflected prejudices, perceptions, and biases of their designers and programmers. With respect to the more subjective, fluid, and variable qualitative factors, such as ethnicity, cultural background, educational level, emotional expressions, and sex and gender performances. It's actually the case that sex and gender are reductively essentialized, reified, and even caricatured in the design and programming of humanoid robots. Now, how roboticists and how we ourselves can help to fix this problem is an issue I'll be addressing in my closing comments. So let me show you a good example of the unreflexive sexism and gender bias in AI. Now, although the incident in question occurred 9 years ago, it remains very timely and relevant. Now, in 2013, the bi-monthly Journal of the Japanese Society for Artificial Intelligence, or JSAI, embarked on a makeover of its humdrum cover to ostensibly attract more subscribers. An online competition for the cover illustrations of the 2014 issue attracted 100 entries. The editors described the winner as, quote, effectively representing the integration of embodied artificial intelligence into everyday life, end quote. And here's the cover of the first issue, January 2014. Several days later, the editors posted, Several days later, the editors, sorry, I lost the page. The cover features a watercolor of a feminine robot with a cable connected to her back. Her face, and especially her big eyes, resemble Japanese cartoon characters. She's holding a book in her right hand and a broom in her left. Something or someone has interrupted her reading. But why is she, a robot maid, reading a book in the first place instead of sweeping the floor? And in my book, I discuss all the covers published in the 2014 issue, which tell a story about this robot maid. Well, criticism of the robot maid cover was swift. The editors were swamped with letters rebuking their choice of cover art. Regardless of the anonymous illustrator's actual intentions, the image equates women with housework and implies that book learning distracts working women from household chores. Several days later, the editors posted a long apology on the journal's website. They explained that, and I quote, because artificial intelligence is something that cannot be seen with the eyes, we wanted to have an image that made AI easy to understand. And let me repeat that, it's very interesting. Because artificial intelligence is something that cannot be seen with the eyes, we wanted to have an image that made AI easy to understand. So let me continue their apology. We did not intend for the cover art to discriminate against women. However, the image of a feminine robot connected to a cable and cleaning house gave that impression, end quote. So to summarize, the editors claim to have been unconscious about their own unexamined sex-gender biases and only became aware of their biases when their choice of cover triggered a huge outcry. Subsequent JSAI covers feature cartoon women using and living with robotic devices instead of actually embodying AI itself. So let's get back to actual robots. Now, some humanoid robots developed in Japan over the past 2 decades are gendered, if only by name. For example, Yasumaru-kun, and kun is a suffix marking a masculine subject. The gender of other robots is sometimes ambiguous to the untutored eye. Wakamaru, for example, was first marketed by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in 2005 as a household valet and babysitter, but that proved impossible because of safety concerns and also the cost. Now, when I show audiences in the United States and Europe a picture of Wakamaru, many perceive a feminine robot on account of its petticoat-like shape. But Wakamaru was designed as a masculine robot. His 1-meter-tall conical body on wheels resembles the shape of yoroi, medieval samurai armor. Moreover, Wakamaru's name was inspired by the legendary 12th century samurai, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, whose childhood name was Ushi Wakamaru, young ox. And the 2 sensors, which are infrared and ultrasonic on the robot's forehead, supposedly resemble Yoshitsune's eyebrows. The designer selected yellow for Wakamaru's body because he declared it's a color that attracts attention, is invigorating, and conveys happiness. Now, one of the most technologically advanced humanoid robots that debuted in 2009 is HRP-4C, the Humanoid Robotics Project for Cyborg. She's a creation of AIST, or the National Institute of Advanced Industrial Science and Technology in Tsukuba. It's the Japanese MIT, basically. HRP-4C is a cyborg in the sense that her face and body proportions are based on the average 20-year-old Japanese female. She's 1.6 meters tall and weighs about 43 kilograms, which is about 10 pounds or 10 kilograms lighter than the average young woman. The technological reason for her design and development was to reproduce human-like bipedal walking using a motion capture process in recording and programming. Now, of course, a masculine robot could have served the same purpose. But in any case, the robots focused on three characteristics of human bipedalism, that is, heel-to-toe walking motion. So there's single toe support, knee stretching, and swing leg motion, as you can see here in the middle image. So HRP-4C has a much more natural human-like walk than Ashimo does. Ashimo is very flat-footed and his knees are always bent for stability when standing and walking. I want to also just simply point out something that many people don't know about, but all of these robots are equipped with noise filtering shoe soles, as the sounds of locomotion and all ambient and accidental sounds in the environment are read as data by robots. So without major noise filtering algorithms, which take up a lot of memory, mobile robots would develop software glitches and break down. HRP-4C is nicknamed Meme, and I couldn't find an official explanation for her nickname Meme, but I surmise that it may be a reference to meme, M-E-M-E, in reference to patterns or elements that can be imitated. Also, neuroscientists explain that a meme is a perceived behavioral scheme that can be translated by the brain into an action scheme, making the imitation of the perceived behavior possible. So the nickname meme likely points to her ability to mimic human female and feminine behaviors via motion capture technology through speech recognition, software, and also, as we'll see, Yamaha's Vocaloid singing voice synthesizer. And I'll show a footage of Meme singing in a few minutes. Framed by shoulder-length black hair in a page boy style, her silicone face was fashioned from a composite photograph of 5 female secretaries at the lab where she was created. Like her face, Meme's large hands are also covered in a silicone skin, but the rest of her anthropometrically scaled body is made of silver and black plastic. And I never got a good answer as to why a robot body needs such realistic anatomical features, or what the 5 secretaries thought. It's another matter. Is she naked? Her cousin Ashimo was modeled after a suited astronaut. And at public events, Meme often appears clothed, cosplaying as a bride, a dancer, a French maid, and as the popular anime Vocaloid, Hatsune Miku. One of her only real-world functions is as an entertainer. She sings and she dances. And let me show you a video here. Well, hopefully you can hear it. If you can't, you can watch your own video. I think you get the idea. And I just want to note the incredibly complex technology that enables a bipedal robot to lift and balance on one leg, and to move in sync with the music. These are innovations, of course, that are parlayed into some of the spin-off industries I mentioned earlier. Okay, at this point, I want to shift to a comparison of human and robot bodies with respect to sex and gender. And there are at least two kinds of human bodies, the female body and the male body. That said, as you can see here, female and male bodies themselves are distinguished by a very broad spectrum of biological variability from outward or phenotypic appearance, that's to say their size, shape, color, to biochemical, hormones, chromosomes, so their biochemical constitution, to post-puberty, the usual physical capabilities of male and female bodies. You have menstruation, pregnancy, lactation, ejaculation, and so forth. Now, there are also intersexed infants whose bodies don't conform to this anatomical binary. And if this were a different talk about humans, I'd go into more detail about this point. But it's safe and accurate to say that at birth, the majority of human bodies, anatomically speaking, more or less conform outwardly to two basic patterns designated female and male. Gender, however, is not simply a natural feature or characteristic of a given female body or a given male body. Gender defines historically, culturally, regionally, socially, individually determined or defined or performed modes of speech, dress, hairstyle, body language, and adornment. Most humanoid robot bodies are purposefully designed from the start to fit a particular task or vision. And since these tasks are often gendered, a given humanoid's body is gendered from the design stage, as was the case in me. Now, in humans, however, gender, femaleness, maleness, femininity, masculinity, is ascribed at birth based on sex, which in turn is based on visible and unambiguous genitals. Now, of course, gender is ultimately fluid and contingent upon personal choices and also upon social, cultural constraints and circumstances. In anthropology and in feminist theory, we refer to this as the sex-gender system, or to the set of arrangements by which a society transforms biological and anatomical sex into gender ideology, which is a product of human activity. Now, in robots, gender, however, is a necessary condition of the body. That is, a robot's assigned gender, both precedes and determines the design and construction of its body. Now, you can see the primacy and necessary condition of gender in some of the robotic engineering literature on gender. Now, much of this so-called robot gender research published in robotics journals, which few social scientists seem to read, has two angles. One asks whether human females and males interact differently with robots. In this case, human femaleness and maleness are interpreted reductively as binary or polar opposites. And so the implication is that by virtue of their anatomical bodies, female and male, and ascribed gender roles, feminine and masculine, they should relate differently to robots. The other angle explores whether people interact differently with a feminine or masculine robot. In this case, the binary polarization is shifted to robots, and based on such reductive stereotypes as waist to height ratio, shoulder width, and lip color. So an hourglass figure and pink lips identify a female or feminine robot. Now, let me quote from one such study, actually this study here on the right, in which the following hypothesis was proposed. A male or female robot, and I'm quoting, a male or female robot queried users about romantic dating norms. We expected users to assume a female in the robot knows more about dating norms than a male robot. If so, users should describe dating norms efficiently to a female robot but elaborate on these norms to a male robot. Users, especially women discussing norms for women, used more words explaining dating norms to the male robot than to the female robot, end quote. So I want to point out a couple of things. Note the use of female instead of feminine, i.e. the gender, and male instead of masculine, showing that the researchers conflated sex and gender, using them as if they meant the same thing. These roboticists based their hypothesis on taken for granted stereotypes of human female and male behaviors, in this case about dating, which was also constructed in heteronormative terms. Okay, let's consider some possible solutions to sex-gender bias in robotics. Now, scholars across the disciplines increasingly recognize that AI and modes of robot embodiment reflect the conscious and unconscious biases and orientations of the human programmers and designers. And this has to do in part because of the academic divide between the physical sciences and engineering, or in Japanese, ri, and the arts and humanities, or bun, a divide especially prominent in Japanese universities, but also present in universities in the United States. The majority of robot engineers remain unfamiliar with concepts like the sex-gender system or diversity, much less feminist perspectives, which are more commonly invoked in the humanities and social sciences. The majority of roboticists, who in Japan are at least 90%, in my experience, tend to take for granted the pink and blue gender division of labor they saw growing up, and that is likely present today in their own homes and offices. This is largely with roboticists in the United States as well, whether or not they identify as female or male, including those writing about gender dimensions of robotics. So knowledge of unconscious biases doesn't come naturally. It's something that has to be learned. Now, when I present my work on robot gender and robosexism, I'm often asked by audiences about the possibility of queer robots. Now, this is an image used by a project initiated by the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim to explore what a queering of robots might entail, noting the need for queer perspectives in AI and robotics. And I contacted the illustrators, and they told me by email that they had been asked to design an image of a gay-friendly robot. The rainbow coloring of the robot is meant to represent embodied AI that is queer, or more specifically, non-binary. But what has yet to be discussed is how such a robot would actually function. LGBTQ plus perspectives and behaviors are hardly homogeneous or free from political, class, ethnic, gender influences themselves. How and what exactly would LGBTQ plus perspectives contribute to robot design and embodiment, or to applications of robotic technology? What would a tangible queer robot, as opposed to a cis or straight robot, look like? And why would it matter? Similar problems arise in artificial intelligence with respect to facial and vocal recognition software based on essentialized reductive models of ethnicity and voice. Now, obviously, there's no singular, definitive way of acting, much less being queer or straight, for that matter, and gay-straight identities and practices actually constitute a fluid spectrum of behaviors, especially over time. For a humanoid robot capable of some level of gesture and equipped with a vocal synthesizer, to perform as queer or straight would simply represent its programmers' algorithmically reproduced assumptions and even biases, whether or not those programmers themselves identified as LGBTQ+. So the result would be but a stereotype or set of stereotypes because, unlike flesh and blood humans, robots do not have self-determined agency. Robots are not under any obligation to conform to sociocultural norms or conventions of gendered behaviors, including body language, modes of dress and hairstyle, cosmetic effects, and so forth. Nor, unlike humans, are robots capable of feeling motivated or compelled to rebel against and to reject sociocultural norms of gendered comportment. And that's something for science fiction. That's where you have to separate the two. That attempts have been made to develop algorithms to detect sexuality from photographs on dating sites alerts us to the very disturbing problem of classifying and reifying entirely relational appearances and practices as fixed categories, in which case the arbitrary becomes the usual. Now, several years ago, I had a chance to observe what I call the accidental queering of a humanoid robot, in this case, an android. And as I noted earlier, these lifelike robots are basically teleoperated devices. So here's a picture of a feminine android at a robot exhibit I went to in 2016 at the Miraikan, or National Museum of Emerging Science and Innovation in Tokyo in Odaiba. The kimono-clad android is called an otonaroid, or adult android, and her role is to converse with visitors, as you see here. I want you to notice this arrow, the control room. Her voice is provided by the wizard behind the curtain, so to speak. The wizard is a male technician who scans the gallery through the android's eyes, generates her facial expressions, and essentially ventriloquizes. This is what's called teleoperation. That day, a male technician, and from what I could tell, a non-native speaker of Japanese, was in the booth. What was sex and gender bending in this case was that the traditional kimono-clad feminine robot was provided with a rather brusque masculine type language, giving her a decidedly unfeminine voice and affect. The technician made no effort to speak in a more polite and thus feminine Japanese, nor did he pitch his voice higher in a higher feminine register. In contrast, HRP4C, or means voice, is produced by a voice synthesizer that reproduces stereotypical women's speech. As you could gather from the video, hopefully you heard it, I showed of her dancing and singing. Now, although this is a case of what I call accidental queering, one strategy for destabilizing the binary construction of robot gender would be to deliberately scramble gender markers. For example, supplying a conventionally masculine voice to a conventionally feminine android. Like Meme, for example. Simply gendering robots as feminine to do what is seen as women's work, jobs that tend to be poorly paid, may reinforce social inequalities. For example, and one solution or one innovative sort of gender bending possibility would, for example, take the form of a masculine receptionist or nurse robot, which challenges current cultural stereotypes and may help encourage the acceptance of human males in those caregiving roles. I also want to mention that gender bias exists not just among hardware and software designers who may take for granted the binary division of sex and gender, as we've discussed. This bias is also prevalent among users and consumers, which I argue is an underlying problem in the emerging field of Kansei Kogaku, or affective engineering. Now, Kansei Kogaku is a consumer-centered approach to design developed in the 1970s by now retired engineer Nagamachi Mitsuo. Affective engineering seeks to design products that are perceived by users as familiar, friendly, safe, desirable, cute, or kawaii, unthreatening, and so forth. Most Japanese humanoids and other robots that I've shown you are developed along these lines on the basis of narrowly designed consumer surveys. However, not only are the surveys premised on stereotypes, many consumers themselves are unaware of their own presumptions about the sex-gender system, much less about race and ethnicity or class division, national identity, and so forth. And these presumptions on the part of consumers, together with roboticists' biases, can be exaggerated in the design and programming of robots. Thus, designers of robots and artificial intelligence do not simply create products that reflect our world, they also, perhaps unintentionally, reinforce and validate certain norms, certain sex and gender norms, and certain social attitudes and behaviors that are considered appropriate for women, men, or gender diverse people. And also because algorithms and neural network development is so expensive, the data they are based on relies on images and information from high-income countries, which constitutes another source of biased representation in the sense of narrow and limited information. And also, there's a tendency to privilege capitalist corporate values in this research. So perhaps the easiest solution to the problem of bias is to design genderless robots like Roomba. And if consumers wish to gender their robots, so be it. In fact, Roomba's consumers themselves often name or gender their robotic vacuum cleaner. Now, as roboticists better understand how gender is embodied in robots and AI, they can design algorithms and, by extension, robots in ways that are safe, effective, and promote social equality. So let me move now to my closing comments. Now, the big question and the big task for us, teachers and students alike, is how can we point technology, how can we point AI and robotics in more progressive directions and toward more progressive end products and applications? There's now ample hard evidence that AI does not create bias. AI reflects and reproduces the prejudices and biases of its programmers, the majority of whom are from high-income countries and funded by corporate and/or government agencies. In this sense, there's nothing artificial about artificial intelligence. It's inspired by people, created by people, and has an impact on people. And that's why we need more emphasis in education from K through 12 through graduate school on STEAM, science, technology, engineering, and math, plus the arts. Now, in Japan, as I noted, there's a deep divide between Bun, the arts and humanities, and Ri, the hard sciences and engineering. Merging them is a focus of very recent educational initiatives, as evidence of which you see here at the 2021 Education Expo in Japan. Some universities, notably Hiroshima University, have inaugurated schools of integrated arts and sciences, Sogo Kagakubu, that merge the Bun and Ri. Ultimately, however, it's the arts and social sciences and humanities that will help provide the intellectual tools both to question robosexist stereotypes and to imagineer truly progressive technologies with enlightened, diversity conscious, and humane applications. And we have a lot of work to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Robertson, for that incredible insight into the way that unacknowledged sociocultural biases can be reproduced and reified both in algorithmic design and on the physical bodies of humanoid robots. We will now have a comment by Professor NAGAI Yukie. Professor Nagai, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for introducing and also the great opportunities to discuss with Professor Robertson. It's my great honor to discuss how the stereotyped minds or stereotyped robots have been developed in Japan, and also how we can change this kind of their stereotypical design in the robotics in more diverse ways. And I'd like to share our research interests as well in order to facilitate the discussions. Let me start with one just video clip to explain what my research interest is in robotics. In my research group has been developing this computational neural network model, which enable our humanoid robots to socially interact with the human caregivers. This is, by the way, the robot developed at the Italian Institute of Technologies, which is called ICAP. Actually, when I introduced this robot, I call him as a masculine robot. And then with this robot, we have been investigating what kind of neural network model enables our robots to acquire the communication abilities with the human caregivers, like emotion interactions, imitating their humans' behavior, and so on. And then they to show you one video clip showing that how the human brains are very good at attributing the social, their intentions or the social informations into the very simple figures. This is from very well-known psychological experiments, which already conducted 80 years ago. With this video clip, you can see that there are three figures, their geometric figures are interacting each other. But then there is no additional information. Just two triangles and one circle are moving in this environment. But interestingly, the researchers found that the people tend to attribute the social information to this figure. For example, now their triangle is moving toward the small triangle. Maybe people think that, okay, this big triangle is getting angry toward this small triangle. Or maybe there is a different emotional or intentional behaviors there. For example, the big triangle wants the small triangle and the small circle to be separated. Maybe the big triangle plays as the father of their small circle, which might be the daughter of this families. So with this very simple figures, you can experience that how your brains, the human brains, are very easily using the social informations to explain the very simple geometric figures. Although there is no social real information here, but then your brain automatically uses your own personal experiences about the social interactions, which may facilitate you explaining this kind of geometric informations. The question is where this kind of abilities come from. What kind of brain functions may explain this kind of social attributions? And my research group has been investigating the brain mechanism from the computational approach. And we think that their theory called predictive coding may explain this social attribution as well. This predictive coding theories, the main ideas of predictive coding theory is that our human brain works as a predictive machine. When the human sees the world, we don't simply rely on the incoming sensory signal, but rather utilize our past experiences or prior experiences. And this internal model makes the predictions about the world, and your predicted signal and their incoming sensory signal are integrated to minimize the prediction error. And as a result, your perception is generated through the Bayesian processes. Here, the yellow Gaussian distribution represent your prior experiences or prior knowledge, which are integrated with the red Gaussian distributions here. Yeah, the point is that because you have the social interaction experiences in the past, this is why you have the social knowledge as a prior. That is why when you try to explain the geometric figures, you want to utilize such prior knowledges to make their information more easily recognized. And then my question is how we can go beyond the stereotyped minds. We have seen in Professor Robertson's talk that there are many humanoid robots in Japan have been designed with some genders. Like, for example, the HLP4C have their female like appearances. I think that this is because their designers, as also their users, have the stereotyped minds. We know the difference between the male and the females. We know what kind of a different knowledge or different their minds they have. This is why this kind of their stereotyped minds would help us to better communicate with the humanoid robots. But then our challenge could be to create or develop the diverse minds or the robot with a diverse design and diverse minds. So how we can design it? Although this is not the study about the gender, but my research group has been developing investigating such diverse cognitive behaviors in human children and also the robots. In an experiment, we conducted drawing experiment where the child were given with their tablet on which only the part of the figure is already shown. And children were asked to draw whatever they like. So you can see that there's some young children just do the scribbling because they don't know what they should do, what they want to, or what their experimenters want them to do. Only the older children can fill their missing parts in order to make their desired patterns, like in a human face or the cars and so on. But then, as you can see, their children show such a diverse behaviors or diverse their internal model. So we think that the stereotyped the minds would develop only through their sensory motor experiences. In the early stage of development, humans may not have such stereotyped patterns in their mind yet. Not only gender, but also emotions, this kind of object recognition, and so on. So to study their underlying mechanism, this is some examples of their diverse drawing patterns from children. And you can see that they're not only their scribbling, but also tracing, coloring, and also the completion pattern can be observed, which is showing their diversity in the child drawing abilities. And then to investigate what neural mechanism may enable our robots to show such a diverse behavior, we have designed the computational neural network model, which can generate such a diverse behavior by manipulating some parameters in the robot. Here you can see the two types of robot as an example. The left one is very successful in completing the missing parts of the figures, whereas the right one is not successful. It's showing some scribbling behavior like their young children. And this is a neural network model we used. I don't explain the details, but here the idea is that just by changing only the two parameters in this neural network model, we could show the diverse behavior in the robots, which indicating that their stereotypical, their characters or stereotypical their features in their robot brain developed only through their very proper predictive learning. And then if their balances between the top-down predictions and bottom-up signals are not well created, then the robot also shows their diverse behaviors. So based on this result, I'd like to ask two questions. The first one is the balance between the stereotyped minds and the diverse minds. In our experiment, we showed that the diversity is very important, and which is, of course, obviously observed in the child development. But then on the other hand, we can also observe that the stereotyped minds or stereotyped attributions is very beneficial also for robots to more efficiently recognize the world and also interact with the social partners. So I think that there are balancing between the such stereotyped design and also the diverse design might be important. So how we can make the balances between the stereotyped minds and the diverse minds so that we can take advantages of these two different types of minds or the design of the robots. This is the one question that I want to discuss with Professor Robertson. And the second question I just asked it during her talk is that there are not only such stereotyped minds, but also the diverse minds, but also the minimal minds or minimal design is also important when we design such a social robot. These are two examples of the minimal design. The left one is the Parrot. It's a seal robot developed at ICE, Professor Shibata, and he said that this robot can generate a very simple reactive behaviors. For example, if you stroke the parrot just make a small sound, but not so like a socially meaningful sound. It's like a different, some type of different sounds. Then also the right side showing that this is called Humanoid, developed by Professor Ishiguro at Osaka University. As you can see that this Humanoid shows a kind of neutral gender. You can attribute either both the female or male genders to this robot. And these researchers suggest that such a minimal design enable the human users to attribute many different social aspects to the robot. If, for example, you specify the gender of the robots, maybe you also limit their interaction with the robot. But if you design this kind of minimal appearance or minimal reactions in the robot, the users can freely change or freely design their interactions patterns, because you can attribute both their female or male behaviors, or it can be animal or human-like behaviors. So in this way, the minimal minds or minimal design can also show the benefits in their design. So I hope that we can discuss that what would be the real good design for the robots, and what design would more facilitate the social interaction with the humans. And I think that such a stereotype design, diverse design, and minimal design would have their different benefits. So I think that it would be a very nice discussion points to start with these three examples. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nagai. And now we will have discussion between Professor Robertson and Professor Nagai.
I'm sitting right across from Professor Nagai. Now you can see us. That was really a splendid comment. Thank you so much. And, you know, I attended your conference last week, and I think I saw you at a humanoid robotics conference in Osaka several years ago, right? So I'm really honored that you agreed to be the commentator. I think the idea of stereotype design for the sake of diversity and also minimal design is kind of interesting. And this is why I mentioned Roomba as a kind of a genderless robot, although maybe Roomba isn't ideal for the kind of research that you do. I just wanted to note the Paro, the seal robot, the Azarashi robot. I know Shibata-san, the founder, and I write about Paro in my book. It's a brilliant shape for a robot. You know, nobody has a pet seal, for example, but everybody has a pet dog and cat. So they're going to be looking at how inefficient the robot dog or cat is relative to Paro, which is used widely in nursing homes, actually, in assisted care living facilities, not only in Japan, but in the United States, and especially in Denmark and Germany. And the idea is to stimulate discussion about the robot among people who have been depressed or locked into an uncommunicative kind of situation. So it's really one of the more successful, I think, so-called genderless robots, although Shibata does have Paro now in many colors, including, I think, pink. But you can name, your Paro anything. The telenoid is interesting. I know Professor Ishiguro, and he's exported a lot of his telenoids to Denmark in particular, where they have been doing some research. I gather it's not been too successful in Japan as something that people really want to hug. It has internet and telephone capabilities. So the idea when Professor Ishiguro was introducing it was that grandparents who were missing their grandkids could hold this telenoid and sort of feel them, in a very skin-chippy kind of way next to them. But it's expensive, didn't catch on. And the telenoid is actually not very soft. It's kind of has a hard plastic, which is interesting. But those are, I think, interesting starting points for developing minimal design. The other thing about the telenoid robot is that it, there's a celebration of the full-bodied, the fully abled body in Japan, the gotai, so to speak. And the telenoid really, in a way, broke a lot of conventional rules about body display with respect to robots, because it has truncated limbs and, would maybe spark another kind of discourse from disability research scholars. I haven't seen that happen, but I think it would be very interesting. But in terms of the stereotype versus diversity, I think the points you made, and I'll wrap up my comments now, about the stereotyped models and algorithms, is that quantitatively they're really necessary in a way. I mean, if you have too much fluidity and too much of kind of a floating transformative spectrum, it's very hard to design fixed rules and instructions. And so I can see how in robotics and the kind of research you're doing, to stereotype or to treat for the purposes of experimentation, behavior that is very fluid, is arbitrary, is really necessary. And I think that's going to be the big challenge, is working diversity into that model without, reducing diversity to a set of conventional appearances and, identities that have been embodied, for example. So, maybe we can all collaborate in the future. Kind of interesting.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much for the answers. And as for the diversity and the stereotypes, I also believe that having the stereotype, their design is very useful, and it can really facilitate the design of the tasks for the robots and also the way of interacting with the robots. But then on the other hand, I also have want to address the challenge to design whether we really need such a gender design or other stereotype design and so on, also robots, because especially I'm very much interested in the neurodiversity in the human cognitions. So which is not about the with or without developmental disorders, but rather we have to think about a spectrum between the human abilities. So in the same way, the genders can be also designed in a more diverse and also the smooth way.
I think those are very, very profound comments, and how to take a fluid spectrum and somehow turn it into an algorithm is really going to be, I think, a huge challenge, but I think it's something you can do.
Yes. Also in the minimal design, I also talked with Dr. Shibata, and he gave the very nice presented the story of his design of seal robot. He actually first designed a cat robot, which also have the soft skins, and then that robot was also kind of successful. That people like to interact with cat, and so it was integrated in society. But then there are people also get easily bored with interacting with the cat.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, the robot could do only the limited reactions, and then humans usually have a lot of experiences of interacting with the real cat. And then compared to the interaction with the real cat, maybe the people thought, okay, the robot is still very limited, so it's not so interesting to interact with. That's why he said that he changed the design from cat to the seal, because most of people have never interacted with seal. So there is no an internal model or no prior knowledge about their interaction with the seal. So I think that's how we can utilize benefit from their human prior experiences or prior knowledges, but also how we don't try not to use such a prior knowledge to induce. It's also the very interesting point in the social interaction.
The thing about the seal robot too is that it does create a kind of a Disneyland type of, this animal. If you translate the friendliness of Pato, and I enjoy Pato actually, it's incredibly cute, and I want one, but they're kind of expensive. But if people then begin to see real seals as somehow, approachable like that and kawaii as opposed to wildlife, it could be reproduce other kinds of stereotypes that come out of comics and movies and whatnot. But that's a separate issue. But it's very interesting.
I also like to ask one point about the very last point in your talks. You talked about their educations. So as you know that we have the little numbers of female robotics researchers. But actually, if we go to the social interaction, social robotics community, we can see many female researchers there. This is very interesting. If we go to the more a technical engineering field, you see less number of female researchers. But if you go to social robotics communities, you can see the more there are people.
That's I have a longer section on that later, but it's interesting. When I was visiting many of these robot laboratories and I was doing research for my book, I was really shocked by most of the roboticists I spoke with were males, but they would depend on their female colleagues to supply, for example, child development, data that they would then create, the psychological data that they would then incorporate into the software for their robots. So you're absolutely right. I mean, even within robotics, there's a kind of a ribun kind of division, as it were. Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, but I think you're one of the few, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But I enjoy
Yes, right.
working in this robotics.
Yeah.
If I may, I'd like to pick a few questions from the audience.
Sure.
So first, an anonymous participant asks, what kind of systems are necessary for kind of sociological research relating to gender and other such topics kind of be better connected to like engineering research and other sort of related fields?
What kind of systems?
The exact question was "Hitsuyou na koto wa nan desu ka?" And I assumed it was kind of an institutional, like institutionally what is necessary.
Yeah. Gosh, I mean, I think it's something we were just talking about. Actually, the attempt to bridge the division between Di and Bun, or the arts and humanities, and then the engineering. I know at the University of Michigan, I was actually asked to be a member of the Robotics Institute because they were looking for people outside of their largely Department of Defense funded projects to work with them on, creating linguistic algorithms, for example, and also social interaction kinds of algorithms, but also to get critiques from those of us in, anthropology and sociology as to how the robots they were designing would be suitable for human-robot collaboration or even coexistence. So these are ongoing issues. I don't have a solution except to call for the integration of these fields and to have more of what Hiroshima University is attempting to do with the Sogo Kagakubu. But what we need to see what exactly how that plays out on the ground there. I haven't been to Hiroshima University and I have no idea, what kind of curriculum they've developed, but it does seem promising. And obviously STEAM is becoming an educational issue in Japan over the past 2 or 3 years. Nagai Sensei, did you have?
I think that robotics is already a very interdisciplinary field. When I started robotics, I already also started studying human intelligence, especially I'm interested in to design the human-like intelligence into robots. So we should learn, first of all, the human intelligence, how human acquire the intelligence and how our brains also develops and so on. So without studying the humans, they're very hard for robotics researchers to start designing robots, because the robots always together with the humans, either in the social interaction, social context, or also they're working in the industries. The robots may help human workers there so that their humans can more efficiently work together with the robots. So in that case, the robots need to understand or recognize the intention of humans and so on. So I think there are many robotics labs and also the robotics department there, which also focuses on robotics, are they're integrated in the many interdisciplinary research field as well. So I think that there are people don't need to worry about it, but then you can benefit from such an interdisciplinary environment.
I just have one comment because I was at a conference in Vienna several years ago on robo-philosophy, which is an emerging subfield in philosophy, has to do with robot ethics as well. And I had breakfast with Ishiguro Sensei from Osaka University, who designs the androids. And, he's always insisted that he builds robots to understand humans. But of course, as an anthropologist, I study humans and across cultures and societies and time as well. And I always felt that the anthropological aspect of studying humans and all of their diversity historically and cross-culturally was not really something he was that committed to, quite frankly. I think he has, and I think he's an incredible roboticist and obviously engineer. But I think, as you were mentioning, it's so the stereotyping of certain behaviors is still so necessary for the creation of quantifiable, calculable processes that solve given tasks, and those are not necessarily the same kinds of issues that anthropologists in particular are exploring. So I think there's the qualitative, quantitative issue, even in looking at issues of human intelligence and whatnot. But, that's a gigantic discussion. So, yeah.
All right. We have another question from the audience from Matthias Timburiba Elian. Thank you, professors, for such great lectures. I have a question for Professor Robertson. I just finished my PhD in design at the University of Tsukuba, where I researched about the effects of binary and gender ambiguous voice agents on voice user interfaces and the perception of usability in an autonomous driving context. My results had shown that using gender ambiguous voice agents were effective to mitigate a harmful gender bias towards women initially found when using binary voice agents. But it does have a downside, the negative impact on the perception of a certain usability factor or pleasantness. But with that in mind, I'd like to ask, as in the case of Roomba, which you can let users decide whether the gender attribution should be assigned or not, would it be a better approach to this matter when designing robots, or would a more fluid attribution with multiple gender presentations according to the interaction be a better way to design it?
Well, I think in the case of Roomba, you have to think of what its task is, and that is to vacuum the floor and not to, damage the furniture, basically. That said, I have a Roomba, and you have to, turn your living room into like a basketball court, free from rugs and furniture and everything if Roomba is going to do a good job. So I tend to do vacuuming myself. But so I think in the case of Roomba, the genderlessness has a lot to do with the function overriding, the gender per se. I mean, iRobot could offer people Roombas in different color schemes, for example, but that's a different matter. But I want to get back to the issue of your own research in the gender ambiguous voice, because it's really interesting. It's my impression that there are a lot of rules and instructions given, on the subway in Japan, on the bus to and from the airport. And it's almost invariably, in my experience, a very stereotypical feminine Japanese language and voice, and more polite than often the English translation. For the Japanese, will often say, we ask you to okotowari shimasu, instead of, and the English translation would be, it is forbidden to, something like that. It's like, whoa. So that's kind of interesting. And so I wonder if already that perception of pleasantness as opposed to something imperative is already built into the people who are listening, to these ambiguous voices, because they're so used to getting instructions from a stereotypic, feminine Japanese voice. I don't know, Nagai Sensei, did you have any?
Yeah, it's very difficult to answer, but I also think that there are, even without having their explicit design of the genders, our brains cannot stop utilizing their internal model to perceive the world. So even if we see the neutral, the genderless robots, but then if it has not like a cleaning robot, but if it has like a human-like or animal-like the appearance, then our brains would immediately utilizing our internal model about the humans and also the animals, which always have the gender information there. So it really depends on what kind of task or what kind of the appearance of the robot have, and then also the how you want to interact with the robot. If it's more like in a social interaction, I think such a gender attribution would be very helpful. It can facilitate our interactions. But on the other hand, if we want to utilize the robot in more non-social way, maybe it's very difficult to give there some example, but then in a non-social way, maybe the gender information is not so necessary.
That's interesting. I guess, again, coming out of anthropology, I would probably not think of the brain as having an internal model, if by that you mean inherent and somehow hardwired in all humans, because I see, intelligence and prediction and whatnot as learned and socialized behaviors that can be unlearned as well. So, and these are big debates among social linguists as well, are, the Chomsky versus others. So, are we hardwired or what's the story? And these are, debates that are much bigger, I think, than our forum here, but
But I also think that it's not inherent or innate, but rather learned through their
I see. Okay.
environment. Learn.
So they're born and then you get the model. Okay. I think we're in agreement about that. Yeah.
All right, we have another question from the audience from Nakagawa-san. Regarding the functions of humanoid robots, there are many things that can be performed without a humanoid robot, right? Such as calculation and conversation, cleaning, for example, with the Roomba. But does the significance of having a humanoid robot with a specific gender, do you think that puts people at ease more so than a non-humanoid robot?
I mean, I haven't done that particular research, and you'd have to have a hypothesis and design the research, and then how would that pertain to all groups of people across all possible interactive situations? I mean, that's a question I can't really answer per se. Maybe you've designed that kind of research, but healing is, that's a pretty broad term.
I'm not so sure about the healing itself, but then I think the human-like appearance would be very helpful, not only in the social interaction, but also the physical interaction with the humans. For example, there are neural system called mirror neural system, which are basically located in the premotor cortex, not only premotor, but mainly the premotor cortex. And then this neuroscience, their evidence suggests that when we perceive and recognize another person's actions, we recruit our motor activities or neuron activities in the motor cortex, which suggesting that our sensory motor experiences plays an important role, not only to generate our own actions, but also recognizing that other persons, the similar actions. So if the robot have the human-like appearance, we can also recruit our mirror neuron system in order to interpret the intention of the robot. So for example, if we want to collaborate with the robots to bring their big, heavy, their object together, or to manufacture some object. In that case, the humans also need to read the intention of the robot, as well as the robot need to read the human intention. So in that case, the mirror neural activities would be very helpful for humans to generate or achieve their smooth interaction with the robot. In this way, I think the human-like appearance would be beneficial for not only the healing or social function, but also the collaborative, their physical, their collaboration with the robot.
That's interesting. I guess I have an issue with a notion of robots having intention as opposed to having this quantifiable data then turned into an algorithm. Whereas in a human, in the case of the mirror neurons, it's one way, at least to my knowledge of various papers I've read, for empathy to develop, so that, yes, you're aware of actions that are taken and that you can learn from, but there's still this kind of friction between the self-intention and then what was mirrored from the other that I don't think you have in robots. So there is still that distance that humans have. So we're not just mimicking somebody else, or we're not just copying, but that it's information that comes in that then modifies pre-existing information, which may not match the pre-existing information in the other entity that is being mirrored. And it gets complicated, but I'm not convinced that robots have intention so much as, for example, there's some work in robots with mirrors and this idea that the robot recognizes itself. But if a robot approaches a mirror and engages in certain actions, it can recognize that those actions have been programmed in its software system. So of course it recognizes itself, but it's not the same self that that humans have, I think.
Yeah, for example, if the robots have their similar appearance with humans and also that shows their movement, like in the hand movement, they're in a similar way with the humans. I think some with experiment already shown that the humans can more easily read their desired movement or desired object for the robots. So I agree that I'm not sure whether the robot has intention, but then at least the robot can have like a goal of their actions. Okay, whether to reach this goal object or reach that object, such as the goal of the intention. And some like human robot interaction studies have shown that if the robot behaviors is properly designed, the human can more easily interpret the goal of the robot.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think in that case, the human can utilize its own sensory motor, their experiences to read their goal of the robot behaviors.
Well, that's interesting. Well, I think, with reference to caring too, I know that many, robotic exoskeletons are used to help people who have suffered from strokes to regain, a modicum of muscle use. But also, I think, with the system that you're suggesting, I know that aspects of that have been utilized in working with young people, especially on the spectrum with autism, for example, because the robots offer a very consistent form of teaching that human therapists, given that people on the spectrum are very, very sensitive to even the slightest change of expression or gesture, the robot bypasses those, that fluid, disturbing information. And so robots in that sense, in the sense that you're describing, with the mirrored action have been very, very useful from what I've read in working with young people on the spectrum and also with, autism.
Excellent. Let's see, for our next question, if it's all right, I would actually like to ask a question.
Sure.
So hearing you talk about Wakamaru-kun earlier and how that's a lot of non-Japanese people would perceive it as being female, since they didn't know about the Ushi Wakamaru tale, right? Had me wondering if there are robots that kind of regularly get sun as their prefix, as their suffix, or is the tendency to kind of ascribe a more, like as a reflection of like a closer, more friendly relationship with like the robot, like you want with like a pet or a child? Is that more binaristically gendered chan-kun ending more common with humanoid robots?
That's interesting. I haven't, I've never heard of, HRP4C meme as meme-chan at all. This is meme. But Wakamaru is Wakamaru-kun, and you have Yasumaru-kun, and you have Peppa-kun, even though what's interesting, back up to Wakamaru, when I first started doing this research, Wakamaru on the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Wakamaru website was always Wakamaru-kun. And then, I don't know, maybe somebody heard my paper or whatnot, but 10 years later, or 5 or 6 years later, Mitsubishi website had Wakamaru is genderless. But the thing is, when they got rid of on the English website, the he, turned it into they, you could see that it was in different typescript. So it's really important when you're doing this research to take a screenshot of, the original, in this case, gendered language, because, the roboticists can always be changing depending on what they sense is, a criticism, for example. And same as Pepper. Pepper was designed as a masculine robot on a SoftBank site. People who've worked with Pepper, it's always Pepper-kun. But there have been cross-dressing exhibitions of Pepper. So a kind of a transgendering of Pepper. And the same thing has happened with Wakamoto in plays by Hirata Oriza, for example, a playwright who works with robot actors. And he had a play called I Worker or Hataraku Watashi, where the Wakamoto robot was able to play both a masculine role and a feminine role, which is kind of interesting. And I didn't have time to go into that, but there are robots that, depending on the task at hand, can have their original gender, altered for the purposes of performance.
All right, thank you very much. I would like to close today's session, and I would like to once again thank Professor Robertson for your insightful lecture and Professor Nagai for your commentary. And we thank the audience for joining and staying with us. You can find the latest information on Tokyo College through our website, mail magazine, and social media profiles. So please stay tuned and join our future events. Thank you.
Thank you.